The original phrase went like this: those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. While morphed over the decades into various forms, it stands as the single greatest warning in light of the Brussels attacks. Because here we are one day later, and all we're getting are the same old bellicose screamings about what to do next. One truly disturbing fact is what authorities in Brussels knew and what they failed to do with that information, centering on the killers themselves and solid unanswered questions about investigators being fearful of rocking the religious boat. There was no real rocking of the POTUS boat last night, as everything on the right went as expected. The left has to give Hillary's fan base some pause. We need to talk about this disaster that is early voting. From the words of the Cuban killer himself, more reasons why President Obama's island visit this week must be questioned, and why it's not wrong to think what he did was not in the best interests of America. Where the mantra is simple: question everything and don't fear the facts. I'm Ed Berliner. This is The Hardline for Wednesday, March 23rd, 2016.
This is my number one priority. I've got a lot of things on my plate, but my top priority is to defeat ISIL and to eliminate the scourge of this barbaric terrorism that's been taking place around the world. And we see high-profile attacks in Europe, but they're also killing Muslims throughout the Middle East.
Go ahead, spin the figurative dial to plenty of other broadcast programs talking world issues. I guarantee the majority will feature exactly the wrong thing to do in light of the Brussels attacks. See, we're awash in knee-jerking to the point of people on every side of the issue, leaving physicians with more ACL tears to fix than anything a bad football team could ever produce. Knee-jerking. We're learning about mistakes made, things that should have been done, answering back with the same old tired cliches we heard after Paris, and all the way back to the original World Trade Center explosion. We need to stop the knee-jerk, stop tossing out useless ideas, start getting to the root of how we at least slow down these killers and stop this panic. As we noted, question everything. Do not fear the truth. Lead off with the respected national security analyst for the Clarion Project, Ryan Mauro, joined by the Islamic world expert and author of Sects, Lies, and Caliphates, Timothy Furnish. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Ryan, I'm going to go ahead and begin with you. Top priority from the president: go after the Islamic State. Here we are again. I could bring up all sorts of reports that I have sitting in front of me today that, to me, quite frankly, are saying the same things we heard after every single multiple terrorist attack. Cliches over and over again. In your opinion, what do we need to stop knee-jerking about? What's the very first thing we have to do that's substantive to try and get to the heart of these killers?
Right off the bat, we have to make sure that the media doesn't act as a force multiplier for ISIS and any other terrorists and make that standard operating procedure. Here's what I mean by that. When the president goes to speak, what he could have done instead of just addressing the attack was package it by saying, yes, ISIS carried out an attack, but they've lost 8% of their territory in Iraq and Syria this year. Talk about the defectors, how they've lost their documents that are leaking to us. And the media should do the same thing. Don't just harp on the same story about an explosion over and over again. Give accurate, broader context so that you're not acting in ISIS's interest and you're better informing your audience.
Tim, there's a good word in there that I think Ryan just used: context. A lot of times we talk about these cliches, we hear these 12-second sound bites. The presidential candidates are using them as well. The president uses them. The speaker uses them. When we get to that context, in your opinion then, what is the context we need to be painting this in order to make sure that we don't lose focus on getting to the core of the problem?
Well, Ed, I'm not sure you're going to like my answer, but my answer is we've got to stop hearing the nattering nabobs talking about radical Islam. Because frankly, Ed, it's not radical to wage jihad in Islam. It hasn't been since the time of Islam's founder. Until we and people in the Islamic world admit that it is frankly mainstream in Islam to perpetrate violence against non-Muslims, we're going to keep having this problem. Because what happens is, with the president's anodyne statements, and I'm being generous, and other such, things coming from major politicians in the West, they are not acknowledging the problem. And even Republicans are just as bad at this. Ted Cruz does this constantly, although I like Ted Cruz. It's not radical Islam to do what they did. Until we get to the heart of that problem, we're going to continue to have this problem.
Now, let me ask you a question here, because you said I might not like the answer when you went into that. And by the way, I love the phrase nattering nabobs. Has not been used for a long time. Very well done. Why do you think that would bother me, and why do you think that would bother people? Because quite frankly, I think you're right on target.
Well, thank you, Ed. And then I misjudged you a bit. But most in the media I've found, even in conservative outlets, when I bring up this issue, they pull back, they dispute it, they try to add all the boilerplate about yes, but most Muslims, and yes, but the Crusades. And thank you for not doing that, Ed. So anyway, I'm sorry if I offended you. I didn't mean to.
No, you didn't offend me at all. That's not even the point, Tim. Honestly, you didn't offend me. I'm really happy to hear it, because I want to throw it over to Ryan here as well, because Ryan here again is part of the issue. I think what Tim is getting to is the template that happens here, and I think that's sort of it. Every time an attack happens, there's a template that the media works from, the politicians work from, the investigators work from. Don't we need to break that template eventually? But then again, maybe we don't. Maybe you can't say much to the general public, because what has to happen is behind the scenes, the investigative work, the real investigative work, the hardcore law enforcement, the getting down to the core of the Muslims, finding the radicals, whatever it is, the killers, whatever it is. We never hear about that. Maybe it's a good thing we don't, right?
In some cases, yes, but there also is room for there to be a greater public effort, particularly with partnering with Muslims, because you want to make people like Dr. Zuhdi Jasser and Raheel Raza famous so that their voices have more influence, because they're competing against Islamist networks that are more well organized and have better resources. And then when it comes to the issue of terminology, I mean, there is no perfect terminology for describing the adversary, and it seems like every expert has their own preferred term. But the struggle is that you have to, in a succinct way, differentiate between Muslims that are practicing what is, yes, a mainstream form of Islam that I would call radical by our standard, but then also there are Muslims that have their own interpretation, and a more individualistic one. And it's very difficult to phrase that in the right way. And so there's this constant argument about semantics.
Okay, good point.
Well, and there's a perfect word for that. It's called jihadist, except that's been ruled out of bounds in this administration.
Well, in this administration, but not on this show. Let's make that real clear. Let's use the real words here, and let's not, again, I'm tired of the knee-jerk and the cliche. Let's use the real word. Now, Tim, let me bring something else up here. While we're talking about this, let's get to the heart of the issue here. The Associated Press comes out with a report today saying that the Islamic State has trained 400 fighters to attack Europe in the wave of everything that has happened here. 400 fighters are sitting there. We're talking about camps in Syria, Iraq, possibly the former Soviet bloc, where everybody was trained to go to the West. All right, Tim, how do we then get to the core of this problem? How do we dig into this without constantly knee-jerking and hitting cliches?
Well, the most immediate thing that comes to mind is you're going to have to pay special attention to, of course, in an Islamophobic manner, Muslim communities. Because although most of the world's Muslims are not terrorists, most of the world's terrorists are Muslims. 2/3 of the groups on the State Department terrorist list are Muslim.
And plenty of those Muslim terrorists hide within Muslim communities, yes.
Yes, they do, because unfortunately there are a lot of people that may not sympathize or agree with the means. They agree with the ends, which is more Sharia law, which is some sort of caliphate long term, which is basically getting as much as they can from what they perceive to be Western civilization that has wronged them. And that's why I say one thing you're going to have to do on sort of the tactical side of the fence is the stuff that they've stopped doing in New York, for instance, which is to pay special attention to mosques and the Islamic community. I'm sorry, my Muslim friends, but until you clean up your own act, someone's going to have to keep an eye on those venues.
Okay, right? Ryan, let's get to that. The cleaning up of the act here, and it's something that, quite frankly, I'm going to bring up with Zuhdi Jasser here a little bit later on in the show. But is it not fair to say, when Ted Cruz talks about going into Muslim communities, he is not talking about walking in there with machine guns and bayonets. He is talking about going in and trying to get to the root of the problem. That's going to cost money, that's going to cost time, that's going to cost cops, FBI, whatever it takes. But don't we have to say to ourselves eventually, we've got to start here. We can't keep ignoring this.
We're in an election year, and so everything a candidate says just becomes over dramatic and played by the media. I don't think Ted Cruz is saying anything that most people would disagree with, which is that if there's a community that is viewed as being hostile to law enforcement. You're seeing radicalism breed. Then you have to have a law enforcement presence there in greater quantity, just like any other community where you have more crime. And it's really kind of a counterinsurgency model, and you have to see that happen in Europe as well. One of the underreported stories was that the European press reported that when the one suspect was shot and then arrested in Brussels, that the surrounding people that were near his safe house, they started throwing rocks and bottles at the police. I didn't see that getting any attention in the American media, but it's a very telling story.
I only have a minute left, 30 seconds to you both. In Politico today, there's a column about Is America Next? A lot of people are coming out here saying this is happening in America. This will happen. Another 9/11 will happen. But the point is well made. It's different governments. It's a scattered government in Brussels as well. It's different European governments, American governments. First of all, to you, Timothy, 30 seconds. Do you believe that we are better prepared for something coming here, regardless of what the naysayers may say?
I think we're slightly better prepared, Ed, but not because of anything the government's done, simply because of our system. We assimilate better. A lot of people have made this point. We don't bring in tons of people and put them in enclaves and let them put up basically their versions of Sharia law and put them on public welfare. We bring people in, a lot of whom go to work. And many of whom are professionals. So they're much more assimilated. But that said, notice we had, of course, the shootings in San Bernardino. We've had a number of attacks over the last few years, and so we are not immune to it.
Right. Ryan, fair to say, I only got 20 seconds for you, that yes, we have to be vigilant. Yes, we have to make sure that we watch, but we are better prepared. Yes?
Yes, the only thing I would add is that in the number of 400 to 600 ISIS fighters have been trained to go and attack Europe, the reports are coming out say that they're interlocked. So you're dealing with a network with that number, which makes their power exponentially greater.
You're dealing with something that, boy, we got to talk about next time, because this is not a cell war. This is a war that is global with people that are connected around the world. It has to be looked at that way, not cells. We're going to do that next time. Tim Furnish, Ryan Mauro. Gentlemen, thanks so much for getting the blood pumping. The need to remember we're in a presidential election cycle, and a different issue we haven't talked much about is next on The Hard Line.